Good afternoon. Oh, they spoiled the surprise. Well, I am so happy to be back in Pittsburgh and to introduce the speakers who will talk to us about place and its importance from a physical design standpoint and also from a standpoint of neighborhoods being opportunities for diverse backgrounds to succeed in the places they live. And this is an important topic for me, specifically because I'm concerned about place from an equity and justice perspective. And as you now know, I'm at Harvard as a Loeb Fellow at the Graduate School of Design. And thanks. And I have an opportunity to do some more research around these topics and to come up with creative solutions like our speakers will talk to you about in a bit. But I actually am participating in this fellowship with 8 amazing people who are also thinking about equity and justice in place. Those of us who are living in the United States are thinking about this from a racial and class perspective in Southside Chicago, metropolitan Dallas, and in New York City. But we do have a cohort who's from around the world. And so their perspectives are a bit different, but just as important. So we have one fellow who's from Ethiopia and is trying to really kind of make sure that there's some gender equity within architecture. We have a fellow who works in Palestinian refugee camps and trying to bring dignity to the people who've been living there for over 70 years. And we also have a young woman who works in Nepal, the Philippines, and Japan, and trying to help older people physically design and build places where they can age with dignity in place. So this is not just a Pittsburgh phenomenon, obviously, or national one, but this is work that we're doing internationally. So I'm excited to be joining such a really impactful and incredible group of people at Harvard. But obviously, as you know, my concern is about Pittsburgh. I have been working around neighborhoods, predominantly African-American neighborhoods in Pittsburgh for about 5 years now. And there's one project in particular that I really do adore, and it's the Urban Matters Project. And that project is really important because it does speak to the importance of place and how our young people have to feel comfortable in place and that they have a right, particularly African-American kids have a right to the city, just as everybody else does. So the program, it's designed, it's modeled after the Center for Urban Pedagogy's program. They're based out of Gowanus, Brooklyn. But the program is really to really figure out how to help young people demystify public policy. And these policies around planning and land use are important, and they impact their lives and lives of their parents and their neighbors. And so this is an empowering program so that young people can know that they can access the places that they don't ordinarily go to. And they can access the people who make decisions about their neighborhoods. So they definitely go out and interview the adult residents in their neighborhoods, their community leaders. They interview elected officials. They interview their council people. The last Urban Matters program interviewed the mayor about urban infrastructure. So these are really important. The process of this program is probably more important than the actual final document, which is usually a video. And I believe that the P4 website does have a little blurb about it. So place is important, and I am looking forward to hearing our 3 speakers. The first that you'll hear is Kai Bergman. Kai is a partner at Big Group, based out of New York and Copenhagen. And Big is an architecture, planning, and design firm, and almost kind of a think tank. And they work worldwide. And I met Kai actually last year during the design rethink of the Lower Hill District. And so I'm looking forward to see what the updates are around that project. Our second speaker is Angela Blanchard, and she's the president and CEO of Neighborhood Centers, Inc., which is based in Houston. And she's basically a one-stop shop for community development, and neighborhoods, according to Neighborhood Centers, are places where people can thrive and where people from diverse backgrounds can make very thriving neighborhoods. And lastly, Liz Obu, sorry Liz. She's a designer and founder of Studio O, And Liz works globally with immigrant populations as well as vulnerable communities and low-income communities. And she works from a design perspective around equity in design. So please help me welcome these speakers, and thank you so much for listening to me. And I hope that you guys are enjoying the conference.
Thank you. Greetings, Pittsburgh. So I'm here actually at the invitation of the Heinz Foundation and the city of Pittsburgh, the mayor's office, to actually sort of come a second time. I was here, some of you may have seen the last time. So I'd like to actually show you what we have done sort of in the past year since I was here last. And maybe some of you know a little project that we've actually done in New York called the VIA. This is a project that combines a skyscraper with a courtyard to create a court scraper, a brand new typology that now sits in New York. And just as Central Park is really the green lung of the city at an urban scale, we have basically miniaturized 13,000 times Central Park's proportions to create a courtyard inside a full city block in Manhattan. And now it's a space that actually is there for everyone that is in the building and in the city to enjoy. So it's in a way to think about our opportunities here today to create new typologies, new ways of living, new ways of working, of playing in our cities, because we now have the ability to sort of think about how we live, work, and play. I also showed you previously an energy plant that we're designing in Copenhagen. And yes, it puffs out smoke rings out at the top to basically signify every time a ton of carbon is burned in the plant, a puff smoke ring is puffed out to sort of say to us, to kind of communicate to us how we're actually interacting with our resources and how much we're using. If it's just a trail of smoke, there's no way to actually engage with the quantity. And there's a ski slope on top of this power plant because it's a power plant that provides energy for the city, but it's also an amenity for the rest of Copenhagen. It is now engaged with the city. It's not on the periphery or in the suburbs. It's not something that's a gray space on a map. It's something that's very vital. And this is now topped out and is getting its facade. And yes, we are going to be able to sort of put a puffer on top of the smokestack. I also showed you our project that came about after Sandy. This is, of course, about 3.5 years ago. It created about $20 billion of damage for the city. And we have been tasked with looking at a way to incorporate flood protection that at the same time also, again, serves the city on a much grander scale. So imagine a ribbon of protection 10 miles long on the periphery of New York that actually also is a park and offers tailored spaces for the neighborhoods that are adjacent to it. Imagine being able to ride your bicycle 10 miles in New York without ever crossing a street. So this is now also a project that has been funded for the first 2.5 miles fully, and will start construction next summer. And the next 3.5 miles are funded about half, and look to be also being fully funded in the next years to come. So something that I feel very proud of, being sort of able to sort of rethink what the coastline of Manhattan can be. And to, again, think about how the public realm, public space, actually invigorates a city. I think that landscape architects are the rock stars of our time, because if you think about New York, it is Central Park, it is the High Line, it is Battery Park, Brooklyn Bridge Park, the Hudson River Park. These are the areas in the city that have most recently actually created the kind of economic sort of investment and also increase the tax base in order for a lot of things to happen. Now, since I was here, we've become also involved here locally in the Lower Hill Master Plan project. This is a project that we did with the Penguins and McCormick Baron Salazar, who's been very active in Pittsburgh. The Lower Hill District, as many of you know, is an area that has been sort of over the time has really been cut off. This is one graphic that, if you look on the left, shows the Lower Hill neighborhood as it kind of connected to the downtown area and really provided a lot of affordable housing options at that time. And then in the 1950s and 60s, during the sort of Renaissance, there was also the desire to create movements. All cities in America were going through this. But that was basically a decision from our forefathers that has had decades of after effects. And I think that's also something important to remember when we're sitting in this room, is that our decisions matter. Our decisions have repercussions. So now there's the desire to actually restitch the Lower Hill District back with downtown, because that is a vital link. And we have gone through a sort of a 6-month process where we actually met with a lot of community groups. We probably met with a lot of you. We met with a lot of the city agencies like the URA and the SEA to look at how we can reinvigorate the Lower Hill district and sort of stitch it back. We found that the biggest obstacle was basically the topography, that because you have these steep slopes, when you place a grid on the Lower Hill as it moves up to the Middle Hill, you're looking at a 14% grade difference. That means that really no one wants to walk, you're not going to bike so much, and really you're going to privilege the automobile. So you're already basically saying that the streets rule. Everything else is subservient to the streets. We came up with the idea, what if we actually said that the biggest slope across the entire 28 acres was 5%? That would allow strollers, that would allow walkers, bikes, and people walking. So instead of thinking of what we normally do, which is to place a grid on the 28 acres, we looked at it as a crisscross set of paths, that the kind of path network was the primary kind of organizational principle. Then we wanted to sort of create an organizational piece that basically created a public realm, basically a park, that connected downtown across a cap and then meandering, zigzagging up the hill. So again, we would only have a 5% grade difference. It would then connect with Wiley Street up at the top and move into the Middle Hill. We also looked at a way to think about the heights so that everyone could actually have views, because the beauty of your topography in Pittsburgh is that it's really hard not to have a view. So we wanted to take advantage of that slope, that steep slope, to look at how we were going to organize the buildings and also preserve the views from the people that are already living up on the hill, the upper hill. And so we, just as we were thinking of creating a new typology in New York with the court scraper, we were thinking about what kind of building would make sense here in Pittsburgh. And what we came up with was, if you look at on your left, these are sort of the standard boxy buildings that you see everywhere when you sort of look out. What we propose is a kind of terraced building. That terraced building actually allows you to take advantage of the slope and to allow for terracing that allows for the indoor-outdoor movement of people and enjoying basically the views that are now able to be had. So it's in a way that you could, at this point, Pittsburgh has 150, 200-year or longer history, that you would be able to create a new typology that really takes advantage of that slope. And then you have commercial buildings that are getting taller and taller as they meet the city. So here is something that I'm really excited to also share with you, is that the Tiger funding, the federal funding for the CAP, has been approved. So basically that's the first step now to sort of cross that divide that was created by the interstate, and to actually then also get up to the hill. So we're really looking forward to these first projects as we integrate these principles and ideas into the planning that is already in place. Now, I know that Pittsburgh also is and finds itself as sort of a center of the autonomous vehicle. And there have been plenty of speakers that have sort of spoken about what that means to you. I would like to sort of show you what that means to your city in terms of space. We were asked by Audi. Audi is, of course, the German automaker. They were afraid because architects were showing the future and there were no cars in the future. It was only people riding, sort of bicycling and smiling and walking everywhere. And for Audi, it was like such fear that in 50 years there would be no automobiles. So they came straight to us, the source, and they said, please tell us, how do we get cars into your renderings? And so we basically said, we'll take this challenge, we'll listen, and we'll talk to you. So the 4 rings are actually 4 automotive companies that came together. And they're very proud of their sort of technical expertise. We said, and we asked them basically, what are you? And they said, we are a car company. And we said, nope, you're a mobility company. You could actually be auto bikes. You could be auto trains. You could be Audi blades, Audi driverless technology or driverless cars. The idea was that you could create an Audi experience no matter what mode of transportation that you would take. And they loved this idea. And we said that you could have the same sort of leather smell, the same clunk of the door, no matter what kind of mobility service that you took. So they asked us to do a little bit more research. So we took that as a challenge to sort of look at how we organize ourselves today. And this is basically a picture of the 405 in Los Angeles. We just add lanes. When you look at basically the history of automation, since the 1970s, there has been sort of more and more research in how cars can actually drive themselves. Here is a 1995 and 1998 sort of study of basically, once you have cars that are basically automized, they know where they are in relationship to everything else. They no longer need the space on an interstate, because the only reason that we have so much space between ourselves is that we don't know what the other driver is going to be doing. Now, that requires a lot of space. If we could actually create automobiles that basically take out that sort of question, then we could actually place a lot more cars into the same space. Now, we have been living with automized subway systems for decades. We have been flying on cruise control for even longer. Tom Cruise is in cruise control. So, basically this is something that is defined and we know. Cars have been using sort of anti-lock brakes, they've been self-parking. So basically this is something that's just sort of integrating itself into our society. When we look at cities, this is a city, Barcelona, that was built in the medieval period when people were walking. So the streets are crooked and narrow, and they're sort of moving in all directions. Same city, but now organized along the horse and cart, the buggy. So Barcelona, the grid, very famous, very beautiful, proportioned, but it's all based on basically riding around in a horse. Then we move to public transportation, Moscow, one of the sort of earliest subway systems, and here they created sort of garden cities where you would take the subway out into the suburbs, have a wonderful green park, and then you would have these sort of high rises that are going all around. Los Angeles is one of the first cities built after the car was invented. So you have basically an infrastructure that is purely car related. If we take the interchange of the 10 and the 405 and look at it, that is the same size as downtown Copenhagen, the medieval space. So imagine how much space we are taking up in just moving people in 4 different directions. Also, of course, there's the speed with which we travel. That also necessitates how long we need to actually change. We have been giving the kind of transportation engineers the rule of law of how our cities are actually organized. So our question is just, is there a new paradigm? Is there a new way of actually organizing our cities? We feel there is. Because as I mentioned to you before, when you have basically 4 cars right there using up that space because of how much distance needs to be between 2 drivers, we could pack 12 cars into the same space if they're autonomous. Now, we use 15% of our cities for roads, pavement, and getting people from one place to another. We could pack the same amount of people into 5%. That leaves 10% of our cities that could either be for growth, meaning there are more of us, or we can start to actually develop those 10% in a new way, to use that space in sort of a way that actually creates a more invigorating space. Now, I'm going to challenge you guys with Lower Hill Master Plan. Did you realize that those 28 acres don't require a single parking space in the building code? Because of its proximity to downtown, because of wanting to sort of also reinvigorate and support people moving. Now, do you think that, and the challenge is, do you think that people will actually build buildings that have no parking spaces? Perhaps not, but the possibility exists. You here in Pittsburgh could develop in the first buildings in the nation adjacent to a downtown area where the parking is not the sort of requirement, not the priority, not the sort of pushing mechanism of everything above it. You can take all of that space that you and money that you would spend in parking and actually create more affordable units and better places, better public realm. That's a space that you actually have at your disposal right here in Pittsburgh. So we then worked with Audi to think about how that future street or future space can be. People are okay with giving up driving. Just think about the yellow cabs in New York. And then we developed a street for the future. This is an example that we did where the car is driving and everything it's being sensed. So the arrow shows how the car is driving and how people and obstacles are reacting to the car and how the car reacts. So this is a smart street where you could imagine that the cars, or if there's an obstruction in front of the car totally stops. Once the obstruction leaves, the car can travel again. So this is a space, a place where we could create a new paradigm shift of how people move through the city, either in many fewer lanes, because now we can use the lanes more intelligently than just passive concrete and asphalt. So this is a challenge that I have for all of you. Thank you so much for allowing me to come for a second year in a row, and I look forward to seeing what happens in Lower Hill Master Plan. Thank you.
Is this one? Okay. Okay, which way is go? Green. Okay, all right. So, how y'all doing? Well, you're such troopers. You're still here. So, let me just tell you, I'm super excited about the presentation that just came before, because usually whenever somebody gets up to talk about how cities should be organized, they always use some examples of what not to do. And usually it's Houston. And thank God for Los Angeles. Los Angeles is like that old uncle you have that's a real screw up. And you're always glad when he comes to Thanksgiving dinner because next to him you look good. Like that. So anyway, I'm telling you really, because Houston does have the largest freeway in the world. And we're working on that. So this is skipping ahead a little. The measure of a great city. I hear today all the aspirations you have to be a great city, and frankly, so much of what I've heard already tells me that you are. But for me, the measure of a great city is not who's there. It's not the architecture, it's not the museums, it's not the infrastructure, it's not the freeways or the electric cars. The measure of a great city is who's welcome in that city. And Houston has become the most diverse city in the United States by being a welcoming city. And I've had a front row seat for the transformation of Houston over the last 30 years, and it's been really remarkable. So I believe when people come to a city, or when they've come from a neighborhood to opportunity, I like to say whether you're crossing the tracks, the river, or the ocean, you need a place to begin. And Houston had a neighborhood that was one of the most troubled neighborhoods in the region. It was a neighborhood that everybody talked about in terms of what was wrong with it. And there was a long list. But it was also the most diverse neighborhood in Houston. And using a set of contributions from the public, private, and nonprofit sector, a few years ago, we built this 5-building, 4-acre site in the heart of this really, really troubled neighborhood. And it has a credit union, and a school, and a library, and it has a welcome center and immigration services, and has a clinic, because we really believe that all neighborhoods need all of those things. And we've tried for many years to transform neighborhoods on the backs of one or the other of the elements of what makes a great neighborhood. And it really hasn't worked. So we set out in Gulfton to build something that would be holistic and complete and inspiring, because we had to welcome people from everywhere. We did our community meetings in Gulfton in 8 languages: Arabic, Urdu, Spanish, English, Chinese, Vietnamese. And you know, that was pretty darn exciting. And we had to paint it some colors that made everybody feel at home. And it's a magnet now. It's a magnet for aspiration in Houston. But wherever you go in the world, you find these places, the landing places, the places that people start in neighborhoods to try to figure out how to rebuild a life from their own imagination, how to work out a way forward that's different than the life they were born to. So this is a place in Germany, and this place is in Berlin, and it's a site of welcome for some of the 1.1 million Syrians Germany's taken in. So I really believe that welcoming cities really need these landing places, these places of welcome. And the most successful cities of the future, no disrespect to all of the other ideas, will be those cities that can turn desperation and aspiration into participation, who can build the means by which people can take the deep hunger they have to matter, to participate, and turn that into a real sense of belonging. So we like to talk about poverty. In fact, sometimes I believe, I don't know what some people would do without poverty, because, you know, we like to stack up the studies about it and admire the problem. And I feel like there's a couple of different ways to be poor, and one is when your belly growls and the dollars you earn don't make it to the end of the month, and that's a scary kind of poverty. You don't want to be evicted, you don't want to be not able to pay your kids' school fees, but there's another kind of poverty and desperation that goes with that kind. It's the feeling that maybe there's not a place for you in the world. And my definition of place, significance of place, is the one we make for people and the one we allow them to make for themselves in the cities that we're creating together. So generally speaking, when we set out to help poor neighborhoods or poor people, we have these fabulous deficit models. And it says if you really want some revitalization money, then you write up a report. And you make it really 10 feet tall and 4 feet thick, and you document the hell out of everything wrong with your neighborhood. And if it's bad enough, we'll give you a little money. Now, it's not going to be enough, and it's not going to last long enough to make a difference. But this model of prove to us how broken you are, and then we'll support it, that's harmful. Because we really, at neighborhood centers, we don't see poor neighborhoods that way. Last year, we helped 525,000 people. That was the number of folks whose lives we touched in one of our 70 locations. And over and again, in every neighborhood, we find something much more than lacks, gaps, needs, and wants. We believe that change begins with the first new question. And when we want to help neighborhoods and when we want to work with people, it's not about what's missing or broken and all the ways they've failed to live up to our measure of success. It's really about what's working here, who's working here, what gives life to this community, what has this community been able to figure out for itself? What problems have they solved? What businesses have they created? What relationships have they tended and nurtured over the years? Because we can build on that. And when we set out to work in communities, we document what we hear from the people in those communities about what matters most to them. And we do that with the same dedication and rigor that people usually document what's wrong. And we weave an entirely new story about that community and neighborhood. And the story in Gulfton, the story we found in Gulfton were people that had taken enormous risk in the hopes of a better life. We found tremendous ability and willingness to take risk, a real spirit of experimentation and innovation. And that's the foundation for how we invest with the community in neighborhoods, because you can't build on broken. And, I just got to say one little aside here. Folks like to talk about concentrated poverty. Well, Houston's 627 square miles. It's really hard to get to the level of concentration of anything that people will find compelling. As I explained in D.C. once, we couldn't get all the poor people to live in one neighborhood. But we do have poor neighborhoods, and I always feel like if you want to make a poor neighborhood less poor, and you're really concerned about concentrations of wealth and poverty, we should just get some rich people to move into the poor neighborhood, and that would just improve things a lot. So I think you can't build on broken. I believe strongly that every single neighborhood, every community has strengths and resources and assets, and unearthing that relentless search for those, that's the journey I've been on for over 30 years. And we find people in communities. We find people like Khalid and his daughter. Khalid took 13 years to get to the United States, to get to this country from Pakistan because of the hope he had for his daughter. He will do anything for his kids' education. He will volunteer, and he did. He will work hard. He will learn another language, because his journey took him from Pakistan to Russia, where he learned a little Russian, to Chile, where he learned some Spanish, and then finally to Houston, Texas. This is when you build with people, side by side, not in front of them, dragging them along, behind them, pushing them in the direction you want them to go in, but with them. Then you find that there's no need to motivate. You're capitalizing on the motivation that already exists. So the leaders we need in every community are already there, and part of what we do is search for them. They're the voice and the heart of the community. This is part of, first we build community, and then you build the school and the housing and the center and whatever else the community is asking for, because what you create out of the aspirations of community will be authentic. So now, what happens if, in truth, you're just about to bulldoze everything? So every now and then, a developer will come to neighborhood centers and they will say to me, can you help us engage the community? Because we have a plan for this neighborhood and we want them to like it. And we say, well, that's not exactly community engagement. That's pretty much you've decided, you have money, you have power, and you've decided what's going to happen, and now you want to stick us in there between you and the folks it's going to impact and make them like it. That's not engagement. And we say no to that. Engagement is when you start with the aspirations of the community and your investment is driven by what the community is trying to achieve for itself. So we like to say, yeah, listen twice, build once. And I'm always getting people saying, well, but isn't that expensive and doesn't that take a long time? And I like to say, well, just think how long it takes if you make a mistake and how expensive it is to build something no one wants to use and people don't feel welcome in and isn't aligned at all with their priorities or Khalid's desperation for a better life for his daughter. That takes a long time. That's really expensive. So I want you to know, I don't want you to think for a minute I'm a philosopher or a scholar or a policymaker. I am a practitioner. I get up every day and I go and try to make this work. And this is what it looks like. This is a bunch of people coming together. Right now, we're about to build another big project like Baker Ripley. And these are the folks in Aldine that have outlined a vision for their center. And it's a really wonderful vision that's built on the strengths of Aldine. Aldine's a poor neighborhood, and when Houston went on its annexing binge in the 80s and 90s, we got to Aldine, and it turned out, well, folks there were pretty poor, and if we annexed them, then we'd have to pay for a lot of things their property taxes weren't going to cover. So we just annexed around them and left them on their own. Now that they're on their own, they actually took that as an opportunity to build whatever the hell they wanted, any way they wanted, anywhere they wanted. And what you see in Aldine is a lot of creative housing solutions. You see a lot of multi-purpose dwellings. You see a lot of things that you've never seen anywhere else. And they're wonderful. They're authentic. They're created out of their aspirations. So what we build there has to look like what they've created for themselves, only more so. And it's hard because you hire architects and fancy people with beautiful ideas and they think, this is my big opportunity. I'm going to get to design that building I always dreamed of building. And you say, not really. You're really going to design the thing that people can feel at home in. Places where they can do these three things. Because here's what we've learned. There's three hungers that unite everybody across the globe, everywhere I've been. It's the hunger to earn, learn, and belong. It's easy to remember. And when it comes to measurement, this one is simple. I've been through all the logic models and collective impact, and God only knows, God bless you funders, what you're going to come up with next that's going to require me to turn in 1 million new reports. However, when I want to know whether I really am doing something that's making a difference, are we producing, delivering a program that's changing lives? These are the three things that matter in every community we work in. Are people earning, and can they keep more of what they earn? Are we raising their ability to their wages? Are their incomes going up? The second thing, are they learning? Are their children learning? This is a hunger we all have. And I'll tell you, many parents may have given up on the possibility they'll ever learn again or anything more. They may have accepted they'll have a lifelong struggle, but they can't accept it if that's their children's lot. They won't accept their kids not having a better opportunity. So earn, learn, and belong. Social connection, there are lots of fancy names for it. I call it neighbors living as friends. It's our way to see to it that people come together, learn from one another, have a voice, and be able to exercise it on their own behalf. So while you're doing this work, and I'm speaking to all you community development folks out there, all the while you're actually getting stuff done, there'll be a whole collection of people standing around you saying, really, helpful things like, well, that'll never work and no one's going to fund it, and it's not scalable, and it's not replicable, and it's going too slow, and it's not going fast enough, it's too big, it's too small. And my personal favorite, right in the middle of raising money for Baker Ripley, somebody said to me, that has a snowball's chance in hell of ever being built. And now snowball's chance in Houston is about the same as in hell, so I knew exactly what he meant, but we did do it anyway. So the thing is, don't start if you're a careerist. Don't start if you're worried about what your reputation is going to be. Don't start if you have to have everything you do be a success. Because this is hard work, and in the midst of raising money for something, you might find that there's a big economic downturn or a hurricane or heaven knows what else. You have to make a commitment to see it through. It's called leadership, and what gets led gets done. So I'm going to, so I have to say, I really love the street musicians in New Orleans. Because here's a street musician in New Orleans. The street musician doesn't go out on the street and say, well, when someone gives me some money, I'm going to play. When somebody provides me a plan and some sheet music, I'm going to play. When someone builds me a stage, I'm going to play. So a lot of community development work, a lot of creating these landing places and on-ramps, it's improvisation. It's the process. You go out with the instrument, you start playing. You get going. You work with what you have. And whenever you think you don't have much, I've just come from the oldest refugee camp in Lebanon. This is a camp with no green space because everything is built this close together. So they're figuring it out, how to put the gardens on the roofs of the houses. So in every community, everywhere, every part of the world, there are strengths and resources and assets that can be built upon. But when you begin the building process, this is a really important leadership message, and it's a tough one, and I always agonize about whether or not to say it. We are all standing, always, on sacred ground. We're standing on the ground of things that came before us, of dreams and hopes and buildings that stood right where we're standing that meant something to someone. We're standing on sometimes the failed policies of the past. We're standing, as I did in Lower Ninth, at the break in the levee after Katrina. And in those moments, when you find yourself standing on that ground where there's been great loss and disappointment and hurt of the past, if you need to be the one who can say, I am so sorry, it doesn't have to be that you did it. You just have to be willing to own it in that moment and acknowledge it. That's how we move on, by moving through it. So I'm going to wrap up with a couple of thoughts here. I've been invited to some really fancy cities. They had 12 different kinds of public transit. I was scared to walk anywhere because there were bicycles and motorbikes, and there's all kind of stuff happening. I'm pretty much just used to a car. So, I've been invited to cities that were stunning, and they're featured in every urbanist journal in the world, but really never, ever, ever make a place more precious than the people. Because it really has to work for the people living in this city. And the people you need to make this a great city are already here. And make sure what you create is welcoming for them. Make sure the roots that they've put down are fed and nurtured. Because that's how you grow a really great city. And when you get discouraged, just remember that everything you deposit in the minds and hearts of people is sustainable. It lasts forever. These little guys are in our school. It's one of our schools that's 200 kids in 42 countries of origin. And they're best friends. And I bet you remember your best friend in third grade. What we deposit, what we create for people that allows them to earn, learn, and belong and be connected, it lasts. That's real sustainability, and that's real transformation. So it enormously honored that you would invite me here. I'm hugely excited for you about the journey you're on. Thank you so much for letting me share.
So I have some great news. I am the last speaker. That is unfortunately bad news for me because I've had to sit through amazing presentations where I kept on saying, oh crap, they said exactly what I was about to say. But hopefully, what I will share today will start to talk about how some of all of that can come together and how we can think about some of the many issues and opportunities that we discussed today from a design perspective. So I'm an architect. And as an architect, a lot of my training really focused on how to make better spaces, how to make better buildings, how to create more sustainable places in which we can work. And when I go into meetings sometimes, people look at me as, okay, you're the architect in the room, you're going to tell us how much space we have, you're going to tell us how much furniture we can squeeze in. But that's never really quite sat right with me in terms of understanding what it is that I'm supposed to do. And I often like showing this image when I give talks because to me it kind of started to point at what's the challenge when we start to think about shaping space in a really narrow way. So this is an abandoned library in Camden, New Jersey. And a lot of times when we talk about sustainability, we talk about it from the lens of how can we create healthier environments? How can we make sure that we remove the damage that we as human beings do to our natural environment and make sure that it comes back? So if we look at this picture, we might say that this is a success story. There is a rich, verdant green tree growing in the midst of this rubble. That's successful. But I don't think any of us looking at this would call this a success. I think we might actually ask, where are the people? What happened to this community? It is most certainly not thriving. And so in my work, I started to think about that question of where are the people? And how do we think about acts of architecture and design from the lens of the people? Because if we start to think about what makes a house a home, or what makes a school a place of learning and inspiration, or what makes a community center the center of a community, or an open space, a place of joy and play. It's always about the people. And this is, of course, something that many speakers have talked about today. And what I want to show you through the work that I'm about to present is this idea of how can we actually put that into implementation of the stuff that we see on the ground? How can we talk about this act of creation coming from a human-centered lens, a human-centered design? And so I'm going to talk about a couple of things that I think are instrumental to that idea of human-centered design. The first is this idea of the system, or how can we think beyond the object? So if I go in and a client tells me that the end goal is to create a building, it often seems like it misses so much, because a lot of what we're talking about are communities that are hurting, but where there is a lot of opportunity. And in order to understand that, we have to go back to the heart, back to the people who live in those communities. But we also have to think of the design project as not just being the building, but everything that makes that community thrive, everything that makes it worth living. And so that's looking at things like economic empowerment, social cohesion, and making that the project. And that often means that we're bringing a lot of different people to the table, and we're thinking about each piece in the act of creation from a holistic level. So I'm wrapping up work right now on a master plan for a low-income, affordable housing community in Charlottesville, Virginia. And as part of the redevelopment, its Section 8 property has never been touched with a significant redevelopment in the 40 years that it's existed. And so part of the funding strategy to make it work is to actually turn it into a mixed income community. And so when we went in, we decided we weren't going to start off with charrette sessions to say, okay, residents, what do you want to see here? We actually decided that to start with people, we had to meet people individually.
And so I spent the first couple months of the project going into the homes of residents. And I didn't go in there saying, okay, together we're going to draw what this thing can be, or give me the list of all the things you wanted to see. I went in and said, I'm here to listen to you. I'm here to learn about you and your life. And that for the hour or 2 hours or however long it ends up being, we're just sitting in conversation. I just want to learn about this place and about what it has been like to live here. And so in those conversations, we heard a lot of stories very similar to Tammy's. Many of these residents said, you know, this was better than public housing, but I really wasn't expecting to be here that long. My aspiration of where I wanted to go was better than this. Yet, when you start thinking about Section 8, that rises and falls with your income, having to pay for daycare, where you're often reliant on subsidies, trying to figure out transportation costs, trying to figure out how do you get a better job and the skills you need to do that, it ended up creating a trap where they were never able to build equity and they were stuck. And so when we talked about how could we create this place in a way that would be better, so for some of them, they were just ready to leave. They couldn't really visualize that this could be better. For others, they were interested in this idea of mixed income because they actually thought with people of higher incomes, you might bring opportunity and that they could get access and that this place would no longer be the ghetto and maybe they could move up. But the reality of the situation is the difference between Section 8 and market rate is actually pretty huge. They would never be able to move up here. And so we started to look at, well, if we said that the outcome of this was not just to redevelop this property, but to actually create increased opportunity, what would that mean? And so that started to feed into the development of a master plan that incorporated many principles that were designed to attack the entire system and make it better for these residents. And so one of the ideas that came up was if we really are talking about this place as a ladder of opportunity, then that means that it can't just have Section 8 and market rate. It actually had to have other levels of affordability within it. If the things we were hearing from people is that some of the challenges of being able to move up were their skills, how are we partnering with folks who provide job training for some of the other parts of the development that were supposed to be mixed use? Or how were we looking at early childhood facilities that could also fill some of those mixed use spaces? All of that meant that we were looking at it as a system and we were looking at who were the partners that needed to be brought on to create this more holistic vision. And it started with just talking from the residents themselves. And so that means that the inputs that we're thinking about aren't just zoning regulations or how much money we have to build or what's the space we're building on, but we're looking at things as what's the economic challenges of the residents, or even what is the displacement legacy and how that impacts the way in which they accept us coming in and the way in which they think about the changes that are going to happen. And we think about what we're creating not in the lens of outputs like the building, but outcomes. Where do you want to go as goals? And that's what thinking in terms of a system is. Specificity is another thing that I think is really important when we talk about this idea of human-centered design. So the last couple of years, we've definitely had what we can say is a lot of rough stories that we've heard. And I was talking to someone recently trying to understand what was it about this moment that just seemed different than, say, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, because clearly this is not the first time that Black men and women have been killed. But I think one of the things that struck me that's different about this moment is that we know their names. We're not just saying the random Black man who got murdered unjustly. We're talking about Eric Garner, Philando Castile, Sandra Bland. And there's something about knowing somebody as a name, as a person with a life and an experience, that's different than knowing them as a category. And so in my work, a lot of what I try to do is start to ask the question of how do we move beyond categories? One of the projects that I'm best known for is called the Day Labor Station, and it was one I did a number of years ago before the current craziness that we're in right now. But yet many of the things that we found were quite appropriate. The idea was looking to deploy shelters at informal hiring sites like Home Depot parking lots and gas stations. And our clients were day laborers. And what's really interesting if we talk about the immigration issue is that we either get the positioning on the, let's say, alt-right, where it talks about them as murderers, thieves, rapists. But on the left, sometimes we're not so much better either. That we feel sympathy for them and their plight, but we don't really get into specifics of who they are. If you've hired a day laborer, when was the last time you actually asked them about their actual life? In the case of Roberto, Leobardo, and some of the other day laborers that we met, understanding their life became important for us to understand what it is that we needed to build to make sure that we could make a difference for them. And often when we talked to them, a lot of what they said sounded like core American values. They came here for a better life for themselves and their kids. And for them, these hiring sites were actually sacred. This was a place where they made those dreams possible. And they had actually been able to create quite a bit from those sites. But because they were invisible, they felt that nobody really valued what they did. And so as we thought about what to do, we started to reach into those stories. We also started to understand that not every site was the same. And so it wasn't just about reaching for the stories as a collective, but understanding what was needed at individual corners. So the idea of the project was actually a kit of parts that could be adapted to meet the needs of a given site. So this is an example of a proposal for one in Los Angeles that was supposed to meet 200 workers. And a part of this site also included creating a community garden that could be jointly tended to by the workers and nearby residents as a way to build opportunity for specificity to happen long after we as architects had left the building. Co-power is another important aspect of this idea of building human-centered cities. So I used to use Empower all the time to talk about the work that I do. And it was actually a colleague of mine about a year ago that challenged me to think different. Because they said, empower often means that there is still a power dynamic at work because we who have power are choosing to give it to those who don't. And it often implies that at some level, somebody is losing and somebody is winning. There is always going to be a give and take. Co-power starts to talk about the idea of what if we thought of our goal as shared power, where we all win because we all benefit. Angela this morning mentioned Bayview Hunters Point in San Francisco, which is a community that I'm working in as well. And it's a historic African-American community, one of the largest within the city, but over the last 20 years or so has seen a loss of that population, as she cited. But what's happening now is that it's also the scene of massive gentrification, as many of the industrial sites that populated that neighborhood are now being converted into housing and mixed-use developments. And I'm actually working on one of those sites right now. It's the old power plant site. And what's really interesting about the project is because of the size of it, we are potentially participating in the gentrification that's happening in the neighborhood. And so as people with the power, both my client, the utility company, and myself, there's a certain conversation of how do we create something that actually honors and includes that historic African-American community that's been there. And so as a result, we started thinking about how can we change up the narrative of how space gets created here. I've heard today and also in conversations I had in the lead up to this conference about how overplanned and overstudied things in Pittsburgh feel. This neighborhood had very much the same thing as well. And so we said, instead of holding our charrettes and then coming up with something 6 months, a year down the road, what if we started to make the act of creation actually happen in real time in order to give the most amount of people the opportunity to participate? So instead of having meetings in some hall, we actually started holding events and doing activations on site, like a circus, which freaked my client out, but it was an absolute success. And doing things that would honor people who were not just time-rich, which is generally the people who benefit from the community meetings, but those who were time poor, and making sure that we gave them an opportunity to be able to talk about what they wanted to see here. And that through coming to these events, we set up something that was a benefit to you, that you could come with your family and that responded to things that we had heard, either that you wanted a place where you could hang out with your community or you wanted access to job training. We set up all of those things in collaborations with local partners, and then while you were there, we would have different things that would allow you to stake your voice. And that didn't matter what age you were. We have activities for little kids to state their voice. It didn't matter whether you were a resident of the public housing or you're a resident of some of the newer things that came in. But we did try to register and make sure we were always conscious of what the existing community wanted, and making sure that, above all, we were always giving them maximum opportunity, because if we talk about distribution of power, equity also plays a role here too. So some of the newer residents maybe already felt more powerful than the existing residents. And so through creating these events, we were looking for opportunities to make sure that it didn't matter whether you lived in the public housing, you still had a way to make your voice heard. And so with that, it became this idea of changing up the narrative of how we do projects and how we create these opportunities for people to be able to shape the spaces that they're in now, but then also to be able to lay claim of what they wanted to see in the future. And so this is the first piece that's actually going to come on board this winter. And a great portion of the design has actually been shaped by the claiming of space that people have done through all of these events on site, both through their words and through their feet. And making sure that certain stories that tend not to be told, such as that of the African American community, are registered permanently in this site. The final piece I'm going to talk about is empathy. So this morning, Mayor Fisher mentioned this idea of compassion over empathy. And I want to say that maybe it should be compassion over sympathy. I think empathy and sympathy often get confused. Sympathy is that emotional reaction when you feel bad for the homeless person that you see, or appalled at the shooting of an unarmed black man. Empathy starts to talk about how can we take that and have both an emotional and an intellectual response to it. How can we look at it a little bit more critically? And I think as part of that, it's this idea that was so lovely illustrated as well by the last presentation, of that there is something there. And I think in the race to fix places, sometimes we just want to race to make that thing better. And we're doing it out of the best of intentions. But in our race to make things better, we sometimes forget to acknowledge the thing that is there, the pain that is there. And so when we say, oh, yes, we know that was there, but now we're going to put this, and this will change everything, that oftentimes I find people also feel like that's just another way of not honoring their value, not honoring the pain that they have experienced. And so this is an image from Warwick Junction, which is located in Durban, South Africa. A couple years ago, I was asked to serve on a technical advisory team for the Urban Land Institute. They wanted to remake this transportation node. It happens to house 2/3 of all informal street traders in the city. And as hopefully has become an understanding of my rhythm, I went and talked to people and talked to the traders. And one of the things that we found was they felt a lot of pain, because they felt in this desire to remake this node, to build a mall that was actually talked about as helping to lift their incomes because they would be in a proper shop, that it was being ignored, all the things that they went through, all the things that they suffered. The fact that the only reason why they were there in the first place often had a lot to do with apartheid planning and policies. And so they wanted that recognized. And there were stories that came out of these conversations of women, a group of women who cleaned the street because the city had stopped doing that so some time ago. But they wanted their customers to come to a clean space. Or the vegetable sellers that pulled all of the things they sold together once a week to make soup for the patients in the AIDS clinic nearby. Even in the midst of all their pain, they were still doing things that were incredible acts of resilience. And so rather than having the city say, we want to do this for you, they wanted the city to come and just listen and understand both what they had experienced, how they were surviving and hoping to thrive, and how that could be part of the baseline story of what would be done here. So for me, these are what we talk about when we start to look at what is the human-centered city and how might we start to approach some of these problems that we face. On the surface, they're really fairly simple, but I think they have tremendous ability for impact, and hopefully many of the presentations that we've heard today also help to illustrate where that can go. And I would say, as a closing point, I would offer up a challenge, that when we talk about people, we often talk about the people who are going to be the recipients of whatever it is we in this room are going to do. But a couple months ago, I was asked what would be the one piece of advice that I would give to someone who wants to do this kind of work. And I said, the first thing that comes to mind is to be human. I think when we go into these situations as experts, wanting to use our skills to help, sometimes there can be a tendency that we focus so much on what that need is that we're seeing that we forget that we are also coming into the situation with our own baggage, our own privilege, and that is part of the equation as well. And so the only way in which I can get the people that I talk to as part of my projects to open up to me, to share, to trust me, is if I am also willing to be open, I'm also willing to be vulnerable, and I'm also willing to be accountable. So I hope that as you go out into the world and take some of the words of advice that have been given today, that you also reflect on what can you do to also be human, because that should not be a burden that we place on the communities that we work in. And yet, we being part of that problem can actually start to say that we will create that better place, that better society, that better community that we all envision. Thank you.
All right, for the sake of time, I was told to cut any jokes and to just cut straight to the chase. But if you come back tomorrow, you'll get to see my Bobby Brown impression of a TED Talk. That'll be tomorrow. Before we break out into the breakout sessions, I want to give you a challenge. We're all want to see action. We all need an implementation agenda. And so my challenge to you is three things. First, I challenge each of you to take it personally. This is the one time you're going to have permission to make it about you, okay? The change agenda that we're talking about, the equity agenda, has to be about you. It's not about the government. It's not about philanthropy. It's about you. Take it personally. Make it happen. Number two, call foul. I was going to say something else, but call foul, okay? Every day, somewhere in your day, you come across something that you know this is the same old stuff that got us where we are, and you let it pass. You don't call it. You see it. When you see the things that happen in the workplace, you see it in the newspaper, you see it happen in your office, call foul. We can't keep going on like this. And finally, the last one, please, make sure that what you're doing is transformative. Okay? We can't keep going back doing the same thing. We can't put a green face on capitalism and expect, okay, now things are going to be fine. Our stormwater management problems are not going to fix our economy if we don't decide that we're going to have to do something with our relationship to those people in our city who have been excluded from our economic systems, our political systems, and who've been disadvantaged because of our education system. So those three things: make it personal, call foul, and make sure that you're being transformative.